Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're really diving deep into a topic that we know many of you are super curious about. Egg donation in Malaysia.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Definitely a journey with a lot of layers, right?
Absolutely.
And what we really want to do today is give you like the ultimate roadmap based on what we're seeing in Dr. Alexis Heng Boon-Shin's research. So, from what I'm gathering, it seems like there's some potential like red flags, or at least things to watch out for.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really surprising to a lot of people is that Malaysia doesn't actually have like comprehensive laws specifically about egg donation. So, without those clear regulations, it's kind of like the Wild West out there. And it really puts the responsibility on patients to be really, really informed.
It makes you realize how important like arming yourself with knowledge is before you even like step into that world.
Right.
And one of the first things that jumped out to me from Dr. Chin's work was this whole issue of genetic testing on embryos, specifically, I think it was PGTA, is it?
PGT-TTA, yeah.
Right. Sorry. Pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidies. What is that all about?
Okay, so basically, clinics might offer this test, which can be like really expensive. We're talking sometimes up to 50% more than other options.
Wow.
But here's the thing. There are other options, sometimes even better options, that are cheaper.
So, like, what kind of alternatives are we talking about here?
Well, for example, testing the donor's blood instead.
Oh, interesting. So instead of testing the actual embryo, you can just test the donor's blood.
Exactly. And think about it. A blood test gives you thousands of cells to analyze, whereas an embryo, you only have a few. So you actually get a much clearer picture from a blood test.
And it's cheaper.
Often, yes.
Wow. It kind of reminds me of what Dr. Chin was saying about, sometimes expensive doesn't always mean better.
Exactly.
And I think he also mentioned that this PGTA, it has limitations, right? Like it can miss some rare disorders and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not a foolproof method. And just so people know, you do have other options. Like later in the pregnancy, there's a test called NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, which is another way to do genetic screening that's more affordable.
Okay, so there are options. That's good to know. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed, especially when you're new to this whole world.
Oh, absolutely.
I guess what I'm hearing is ask questions, don't be afraid to ask for alternatives, and really understand why they're recommending what they're recommending.
Absolutely. Be your own advocate.
100%. So we've talked about genetic testing, but obviously like the core of this whole thing is the egg donation itself.
Right.
And I know Dr. Chin mentioned that frozen egg donations are often like presented as a more affordable option, which, upfront it might be, but then he also pointed out that success rates can be way lower.
Yeah.
So what's the deal with that? What contributes to those lower success rates with frozen eggs?
That's a really good question because it gets to something that I think a lot of people don't realize, which is that the actual freezing and thawing of the eggs is a science.
Oh.
It's incredibly delicate. And the techniques for freezing and thawing really need to be perfectly compatible, ideally within the same lab, even for the best chance of success.
Wow. So it's not just about finding a donor with the right, characteristics or whatever, but also making sure that the clinic has the right processes in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Think of it like a lock and key,
Okay.
They have to match perfectly for the best outcome.
That makes sense.
And this is especially important, I think, when you're considering clinics that use traveling egg donors, which Dr. Chin mentioned is a thing, especially in areas like Johor and Malacca.
Oh, wow. See, that's something I don't know much about. What are the potential risks there with a traveling egg donor?
Well, when you have a donor who's traveling long distances, it's just much harder to control all of the factors that can affect egg quality. Are the hormones being kept at exactly the right temperature? Is the donor following the injection schedule exactly?
Right.
It's just harder to manage when someone's not right there.
So it sounds like, just to clarify, opting for a local donor who lives near the clinic, would that generally increase the chances of a successful outcome?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely, that proximity allows for better monitoring of the whole donation cycle.
Right.
Which can lead to better outcomes. It's definitely something to consider.
For sure. And speaking of things to consider, Dr. Chin's research also highlighted the cost differences between going through a clinic versus contacting an agency directly to find a donor.
Yeah.
And it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a potential for significant markup when you're going through a clinic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because sometimes clinics are basically acting as like the middleman,
Okay.
They're getting the donor from somewhere else and then, of course, adding their own fees on top. So it's really smart to do your research, maybe contact agencies directly and see if you can get a sense of like what the price difference might be.
Totally. It's like shopping around for anything else. You want to make sure you're getting a fair deal.
Exactly.
And while we're talking about, being aware and doing your research, there was another point that Dr. Chin made that really stuck with me. He was contrasting, how things are done in Malaysia with Western countries. And he mentioned that in a lot of Western countries, counseling is actually a mandatory part of the egg donation process.
Yeah.
Which, to me makes a lot of sense given like the emotional weight of all of this.
Absolutely.
But it seems like that's not a requirement in Malaysia, which is kind of concerning, no?
It's definitely something that deserves more attention than it gets.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that counseling, you're talking about the recipient couple, their families, and then any children that are born through egg donation.
Right.
They're all missing out on like really important emotional and ethical guidance.
Yeah.
And that can have long-term consequences.
It makes you wonder, like, how those conversations even happen,
Right.
or if they even happen. Because, Dr. Chin's research even touched on how some donor-conceived individuals, they go through, like, emotional trauma or identity crises later in life.
Yeah.
Especially now with DNA testing becoming so accessible.
It's true, yeah. It's much more common now for people to find out, maybe later in life that they were conceived through egg donation.
Yeah.
And if you haven't had those conversations, that can be really difficult.
Yeah, it makes you realize that, like, these aren't just, medical procedures. There's a whole human side to this that needs to be addressed.
100%.
And it's like, when we talk about those potential risks and need for, like, some kind of regulation, there was this story that Dr. Chin shared about a Singaporean couple that really got me.
Oh, right, yeah.
It just really highlights, like, what can go wrong, when there's not enough oversight.
Yeah, and sadly, their experience is, like, not unique. But it really shows how important those safeguards are. So, according to Dr. Chin's research, this couple, they were basically pressured by the agency to go with a specific egg donor.
Okay.
One that came with a much higher price tag, by the way.
No.
And then later they found out that this donor actually had a medical condition that probably should have disqualified her from being a donor in the first place.
Oh my gosh. So what happened? Like, were they able to, get some kind of help from the agency or?
Well, that's the thing. It gets worse.
Oh no.
So Dr. Chin found out that this donor was actually undergoing another egg donation cycle at a completely different clinic at the same time.
What?
Yeah. So basically, because of that, the embryos that were created using her eggs were like really bad quality.
Wow.
Because her body was basically being like overworked.
Well, that's awful. So not only were they misled, but it's like their chances of actually having a successful pregnancy were just like diminished because of this?
Exactly.
Wow.
And to add insult to injury, the agency just completely disappeared when the couple tried to like get some answers.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
So they were just left with like nothing.
Pretty much. Financially, emotionally, just devastated. And of course, because there's no regulatory body or anything, the clinic was basically able to just wash their hands of the whole situation.
Oh, that is just like, it's heartbreaking, and it really underscores why Dr. Chin is pushing so hard for some kind of legislation, right? Like to have something in place to protect people.
Exactly. He believes that having like a law, maybe something like the Assisted Reproductive Technique Services Act that he proposed would make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Both for patients and for like Malaysia's reputation as a hub for fertility treatment.
Right, because you don't want stories like this to become like the norm,
Exactly.
It should be about ethical practices and transparency, all of that. So as we're kind of like wrapping up this deep dive here, it's a lot to process, but for our listener out there who's maybe starting their own egg donation journey in Malaysia, what would you say are some of the like key takeaways?
Well, I think you've actually done a great job of like hitting all the important points.
Okay.
But I think it really boils down to like awareness is key, right? Knowing that right now, Malaysia doesn't have those comprehensive regulations around egg donation. That just makes it even more important to be empowered, to do your research, ask those tough questions. Don't be afraid to like explore all the options.
Right.
And really prioritize both like your physical and your emotional well-being through this whole process.
Yeah, be your own advocate.
100%.
I love that. It's like asking yourself, what can I do to really take care of myself on this journey? And I think, remembering that it's not just about the medical side of things.
Right.
Seeking support, whether that's from a counselor or a support group or, loved ones, whatever that looks like for you. But having that support is so crucial.
Couldn't agree more.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.